Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're delving into one of the most profound and, frankly, most tragic chapters in American history, the Trail of Tears. We're going to unpack the forced displacement, the complex history, and the incredibly deep, enduring legacy of these events. And we'll be doing it by looking straight at the historical record and the actual accounts of the people who lived through it.
Okay, let's dive into this. 60,000. That's a huge number, right? Well, that is the staggering number of Indigenous Americans who were forcibly relocated from their ancestral homelands between 1830 and 1850. We're talking about individuals from what were historically called the 5 civilized tribes. That's the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations. Over just 2 decades, these folks, along with thousands of enslaved black people and others connected to the tribes, were systematically uprooted from the southeastern United States and pushed out to newly designated Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River.
So, here is our mental roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the origins of removal, then the legal battleground. After that, we'll trace the process of relocating the tribes, zoom in specifically on the Cherokee Trail, and finally, discuss the lasting legacy and human cost.
All right, part 1. The origins of removal and the massive push to move west.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark, undeniable contrast between the political rhetoric of the time and the brutal physical reality on the ground. On one side, you've got President Andrew Jackson. He made Indian removal his absolute top legislative priority, and he claimed that moving the tribes westward was actually meant to protect them from white settlement, to let them pursue happiness in their own way. But when we actually look at the historical record, the reality of the policy was devastating. We're talking about forced marches, brutal exposure to the elements, rampant disease, and outright starvation.
The push for the Indian Removal Act of 1830 certainly didn't happen in a vacuum. It was driven by intense, mounting economic and social pressures. The U.S. population was absolutely booming, and white settlers were aggressively encroaching on sovereign Indian lands. Crucially, though, the invention of the cotton gin completely revolutionized things. It fueled a massive expansion of cotton cultivation and the plantation slavery economy, which created this ravenous demand for land in the Deep South. Throw in the 1828 Georgia gold rush, which brought hopeful prospectors swarming onto Cherokee lands, and this pervasive ideological myth that Native Americans were naturally just vanishing, and well, you have the perfect storm for forced removal.
Moving on to Section 2, the legal battleground and the fight for sovereignty.
This quote right here perfectly captures the absolute pinnacle of that legal fight. In the landmark 1832 Supreme Court case, Worcester v. Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall actually ruled in favor of Cherokee sovereignty. Think about that. The Supreme Court literally declared that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct community and that state laws, specifically Georgia's laws, had absolutely no force on their land. It was a massive legal victory. But here is the catch. President Jackson, who was fearing a civil war with Georgia and juggling a totally separate constitutional crisis in South Carolina, ultimately just ignored this federal protection. He point-blank refused to enforce the ruling. So, because the Supreme Court ruling basically went unenforced, the federal government pivoted and pursued treaties to acquire the land instead. And that leads us to the Treaty of New Eshota in 1835. The tragic irony here is almost hard to believe. This treaty was actually signed by a small, minority political faction of the Cherokee, not their official leadership. In fact, over 16,000 Cherokee citizens signed a massive petition urging Congress to void the agreement. But despite that overwhelming opposition, the U.S. Senate ratified it anyway, by a single, solitary vote. And just like that, this highly contested, rejected document became the rock-solid legal justification for the forced removal of the entire Cherokee people.
Okay, Section 3, relocating the tribes, a relentless campaign.
Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds. Because this wasn't just a single, isolated event. It was a systematic, relentless, decade-long campaign. It all kicked off with the Choctaw in 1831, and their removal essentially served as the grim blueprint for what was to come. They were followed by the Seminole, starting in 1832, the Creek in 1834, the Chickasaw in 1837, and finally, the Cherokee in 1838. To put that into perspective, by 1837 alone, 46,000 Indigenous people had already been removed. That opened up a staggering 25 million acres of land for white settlement in the span of just a few years. And while they all shared a final destination in Indian Territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma, each nation's experience getting there was uniquely harrowing. The Choctaw faced flash floods, sleet, and literal starvation during a completely brutal winter journey. The Seminole took a different path. They fiercely resisted in Florida,
fighting a grueling decade-long war with the U.S. Army before many were finally exiled. The Creek actually had their lands fraudulently stolen by speculators before they were driven out. And get this, the Chickasaw actually had to financially compensate the previously removed Choctaws just to get a portion of their new western land.
To really ground these massive, sweeping logistical movements in actual human reality, we need to consider this incredible eyewitness account. In 1831, the famous French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville happened to be in Memphis, and he personally witnessed the Choctaw removal. He wrote about the incredibly somber, quiet atmosphere of ruin. When he approached an English-speaking Choctaw man and asked him why his people were leaving their ancient country, the man simply replied, "To be free." It's such a profound statement. He was expressing a heartbreaking choice to suffer this horrendous journey rather than live under the degrading, oppressive influence of state laws being forced upon them.
Moving on to Section 4, the Cherokee Trail, often remembered as the trail where they cried. Now, the logistics of this forced march were just agonizing. Starting in the summer of 1838, the U.S. military forcibly rounded up the Cherokee into these makeshift staging camps. But because disease spread so incredibly fast in these tightly packed, unsanitary conditions, operations actually had to be halted until the winter. So what did that mean? It meant that when they finally began marching that brutal 1,000-mile route overland, they had to do it in the dead of winter. They had scant clothing, many didn't even have shoes, and they marched directly into freezing temperatures, eventually getting trapped for literally weeks at a time at impassable frozen river crossings.
The conditions they faced were, well, they were extraordinarily cruel. Historical records from a commissary agent of the time detail streams that were frozen up to 12 inches thick in southern Illinois. Can you imagine that? The starving marchers were actually forced to wait at Berry's Ferry on the Ohio River, where local operators flat out extorted them. They were charging $1 a head to cross instead of the standard 12 cents. And while they were waiting, trapped by the ice, many had to huddle for shelter under Mantle Rock on the Kentucky side. Tragically, a large number of people perished right there from the extreme cold.
To truly wrap our minds around the absolute, unvarnished horror of this march, we really have to look to the primary sources. This particular quote comes directly from a Georgia volunteer soldier who actually participated in the removal. Years later, reflecting on his long life, he noted his time fighting in the Civil War amidst massive, unimaginable slaughter, and he concluded without a single moment of hesitation, "I fought through the Civil War and have seen men shot to pieces and slaughtered by thousands, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew."
And finally, Section 5, Legacy and Human Cost, the ultimate toll.
So the crucial point is, when you take a step back and look at the total numbers removed across the 5 nations, alongside the horrifying death tolls from disease, exposure, and starvation, the sheer staggering scale of loss is absolutely undeniable. We are looking at anywhere from 13,000 to nearly 17,000 individuals who died as a direct, undeniable result of these forced relocations. It's an immense, multi-tribal loss of human life, all densely concentrated over a very short, devastating period of time.
But you know, the tragedy wasn't just isolated to the horrific loss of life. Scholars today often highlight this concept of environmental deprivation. The removal completely severed these ancient, deeply spiritual connections to their sacred homelands. It forced the tribes to completely abandon their life-sustaining crops and somehow adapt to an entirely new, foreign ecosystem out west. Furthermore, it completely upended how they interacted with the earth itself. It forced a massive shift from their traditional relationship-based approach to land management right into a resource-based capitalist system that was strictly imposed on them by the federal government.
Now, precisely because of the unprecedented scale of this displacement and death, modern historians and scholars actively debate how to properly classify these events. Some scholars strictly categorize the Trail of Tears as ethnic cleansing, which means using force or intimidation to remove an ethnic group from a given area to make it culturally homogeneous. On the other hand, many scholars classify it directly as genocide, arguing that the policy and its ruthless execution had distinct genocidal dimensions, mathematically calculated to bring about the destruction of indigenous lives and cultures. Both terms, however, deeply reflect the severe, systemic, and devastating nature of the policies enacted during this era.
Today, the physical path of this dark history is actually preserved. 2,200. That is the number of miles that make up the modern Trail of Tears National Historic Trail. Authorized by federal law, it crosses land and water routes stretching across 9 different states. It stands today as a vital contemporary commemoration. It's there to ensure that the paths these 17 detachments followed are studied, preserved, and most importantly, never forgotten by future generations.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to really chew on. We've looked at the hard data, the intense legal battles, and the profound, staggering human cost. But as we know, history is rarely just stuck in the past. So, how does the legacy of this massive displacement continue to shape the cultural and environmental landscape of America today? Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this absolutely critical piece of history. Take some time to reflect on that question, and keep seeking to understand the events that built the world we live in today.